Now, the D6 design was a radical departure from the previous D5 design, both internally and externally. All systems were designed to provide extremely high levels of performance with no regard for long-term reliability. To reduce weight, the only warp reactor carried was a compact third-generation matter-antimatter reactor of completely Klingon design that could sustain output at near maximum levels for approximately 150 hours without shutdown. However, after operating at such levels for a total of 500 hours, an overhaul in dry dock was required to prevent catastrophic malfunction.
So this ship was designed to reach its full battle potential, even for a more limited amount of time. A very Klingon philosophy for a pure warship. What do you think of this, Alec? Has this pre-existing information on the D6 performance made it into Axanar? And if so, or if not, what's your take on the ship and its lifespan and whatnot?
No, I think that one of the things that I think we have a different take on is that the Klingons are they're a little more sophisticated than sometimes we give them credit for. I think it's important to realize that these guys mastered faster than light travel. They've conquered a significant portion of the Alpha Quadrant. So they have an empire. You can't be a space Viking and do that. You have to be a pretty sophisticated race. And so I'm always a little leery when we make generalizations about, oh, well, the Klingons are like this, or like, I bet their ships are pretty freaking awesome, because they have to be, they're all stealing technology from each other. They're all buying it from the Orions or whoever. So I'm pretty sure that everything is pretty, it's pretty sharp and pretty well thought out, and there aren't a lot of, by the time they get to the D6, my guess is there aren't a lot of shortcomings because it's the ship of the line for them for however many years, 20, 30, 40 years, I don't know, but it's so I'm not convinced that there are major shortcomings in the D6. I see the D6 as a real workhorse. As a ship that's made it for years and years and years. And to the point that the Klingon High Council didn't see the need for the D7.
So at this point, we'd like to talk about the obvious evolution between the D5 to D7 and how the D6 starts to incorporate D7 ideas. We'll go into this more fully when, obviously, post-release, and we can talk about all the different things for Axanar with interiors and such. But right now, we'll deal with this. But first of all, a quick history lesson, and whilst it might not make a lot of sense, it is seen on screen and therefore is defined as canon, even if it was a mistake. So a Katinga 3D model is actually used in the Enterprise Series 1 episode Unexpected. This is our first look at a true Klingon warship, and rather than using the designed John Eves D4, they went with the older Katinga model. This means that the D7 Looker battlecruiser was actually around 94 years before the D7 entered the 4 Years' War. This design then gave way to the D5, as seen later on in Enterprise, which had much more of a pointed and threatening aesthetic, which then evolved into D6, as seen in Axanar, which then incorporated more of the older D4 style bridge, and then became the sleeker D7 again.
So, if I was to guess, I would say that we take all of this as true. The Klingons have always loved the D4 battlecruiser design. With the change in Chancellor, perhaps, or designers, they started designing more aggressive and fierce-looking ships, such as the D5 and Enterprise-era Bird of Prey, harder edges and more weapons. Then as their technology improved, they embraced the advances and started moving to classic designs, which incorporated a forward torpedo launcher in the front of the ship, which then evolved into a technologically more advanced, sleeker, and larger D7, with each iteration getting larger and more refined in technology and looks. So within 100 years, the Klingon battlecruisers have a classic look to them again. What are your thoughts on this, Alec, and our design theory?
Yeah, I simply eliminate the use of the D7, the Katinga in Enterprise. One, that is them just totally blowing it. And there are always internal contradictions in Star Trek. And
always ways to explain them.
And I am not the kind of person who feels that the need to make up some stupid explanation. I'm perfectly willing to say that is not canon. That was a mistake, and we are going to ignore that. And I'm perfectly happy doing that. And so that's the way I look at it. That's, you think of all the things they blew in Star Trek. Spock smiling in the cage, right? I mean, okay, there's lots of issues. So you either just write that off, or else you become this canonista that, well, no, it's on screen, so it's got to be true. Screw you, I don't have time for that crap.
But you got to admit, our theory is not that bad though.
Okay, it's good theory.
Sure.
So back to the D6 and the relatively large nacelles, accounting for nearly half the total displacement. They were able to handle extremely high levels of channeled power to achieve maximum speed for days at a time without shutdown. However, due to this design, the warp coils needed to be replaced after a stunningly short 25,000 Cochrane hours. In contrast, contemporary Federation nacelles were normally rated for at least 10 million Cochrane hours. Therefore, the warp coils would be entirely depleted by cruising at top warp speed of 7.9 for 30 days without interruption.
Once again, this was a ship designed to perform at peak efficiency without interruption if needed. I think it was specifically designed to impress the Federation captains with its non-stop battle efficiency, with no real consideration for long-term performance.
So, as a Federation captain, sort of, Alec, or in this case, put on your Garth hat, would you be impressed by this ship? Because we remember the Federation were not necessarily aware of all of the ship's weaknesses when it entered the war, so would you be in awe by the amount of performance?
We're just talking the FASA universe here.
Yeah.
And the FASA universe was written 30 years ago, 35 years ago. So I think there's a lot of things that we see in that universe, and the way they looked at Star Trek and the way we look at it now, that are quite different. And they don't necessarily match up. But that's okay, because they're cool stories nonetheless. I do think that the idea, I mean, what FASA was trying to do there in that description you gave is create the perception that Klingon ships are like Russian submarines, right? That's basically it. It's like, oh, well, they're cruder, they were, more gross in their design, they weren't as refined, which, I always laugh at the Hunt for Red October when they show the interior of the Red October, and like, no Russian submarine ever looked that good, only in Hollywood, right? They were, it looked like, the Widowmaker. That's what it looked like. So I think the perspective that we give to the Klingon ships is colored by the lens with which we're trying to draw the Klingon culture and the Klingon fleet. And so so I think the captains, certainly in the Axanar universe, Starfleet is really trying to get its footing when it starts facing the Klingon D6s in battle, and not just in skirmishes, but in a full-fledged war. But we also have the other Klingon ships still in service in Axanar. You'll see D4s and D5s and Raptors and such. And there's a different design philosophy. The Klingons use the D6, and that's it. The Federation has destroyers and cruisers and heavy cruisers and whatever perimeter action ships, whatever else we have. So that would be an interesting distinction to draw. So I don't get caught too much in the minutia of the performance of a particular ship unless it's required for storytelling reasons. But once we do start talking about that stuff, as we do with the Ships of Axanar book, all that stuff becomes relevant. And then, I mean, we're talking about right now, what other ships do we bring into the Axanar universe that we can put in the book that may not make it into the movie? We have a Markland class now, and I at least want to see one of them at the Battle of Axanar.
Other aspects of the ship also reflected its short-range strike role. Although the D6 carried a fusion reactor, it was small and powered only the impulse drive, energetic shielding, and its beam weaponry, for example, the disruptors. The impulse drive was a high-capacity, high-consumption system, which again was designed to provide extremely high levels of thrust for short periods.
The crew quarters and life support were decreased to the bare minimum necessary for strike missions lasting only a month or two at the most. Definitely a short-range strike ship, being able to go into action for perhaps only a single long engagement, then return to get overhauled or repaired, and also allow the crew some rest. And by rest, obviously, I mean barrels of blood wine. But I mean, yeah, then they return to the battlefield after blood wine.
Yeah, and we can imagine waves of ships always replacing frontline craft and then returning to a nearby port for overhaul, repair, and rearmament. As we see in Prelude to Axanar, they favored torpedoes over the disruptors. This would always ensure fresh ships and crews up on the front lines instead of damaged or crippled ships. A good strategy on the part of the Klingons. It would wear down your enemy while still having a constant supply of fresh troops and equipment.
Yeah, what do you think of this strategy, Alec? Is this how you saw the front lines, or do you think the Klingons would use a more conventional strategy, since all this strategic information was gleaned from older sources?
One of the things we do know in Axanar is that the Klingons are very successful in the war. And I think, right, this is why they didn't go with the D7 when Karn wanted it. So I think your relative success or failure in the war is another aspect of how your technology develops. And I think, again, I think it's always great to look back at World War II and the examples of how technology developed in World War II to inform how technology might develop differently and different strategies. So whereas the Germans in World War II, their strategy was, let's make bigger and better tanks with bigger guns. So bigger guns means bigger chassis. Bigger chassis means you wind up with the Mouse, right? Or the King Tiger or something like that. And United States strategy, which I'm not going to agree with, was, no, let's just, we'll throw 5 Shermans against every Tiger. Well, you needed to, because the first 4 of them got destroyed. So I think this philosophy, when you understand the philosophy of what the Klingon Empire or the Federation, how their philosophy of war machines has developed, then you can make informed decisions about what are the specifics within that strategy. What was the D6? So maybe the D6 was the main ship and made up 80% of the fleet, but there were 4 variants of the D6, right? There was a short range variant and a long range variant and a missile variant. So I think those are all things to take into consideration when you're deciding what is the fleet, what is the D6. And again, as we talked, there may be a refit. Maybe half the ships were refit and half weren't. Maybe there were multiple refits. Oh, this was the refit. So just like their B-52s, their Ds, Gs, and Hs.
D6R12. Yeah.
Exactly. I think the Klingon culture is not one to, attack and retreat. I think they're one to just grind it out with you and just keep going and keep grinding it out with you. So, I don't think the Klingon crews would have been very happy to be heading back home after 10 days, we're done, let's go back and refit and let the next guys come in. Screw it. They're like, so that's my take.
The command head or front of the ship had a powerful photon torpedo launcher or antimatter missile launcher mounted on its midline, and smaller disruptors under the brim of the hat, as it has been often referred to. This forward command section was separated from the engineering hull by a neck, which was 60 meters long but only 14 meters wide. The engineering section itself was barely large enough to house the matter-antimatter reactor, antimatter containment bottles, deuterium tanks, and small fusion reactor. The wings, or support pylons supporting the nacelles, were of the new cranked configuration that would later be characteristic of all later Klingon designs, including the D7.
Yeah, I could see that after dealing with the Federation for a long time, the Klingons decided they needed bigger and more long-term vessels as a replacement for the D6. The Federation were not defeated as easily as they had anticipated with their quick strike approach.
So when do you think the D7 was commissioned? Do you think it was envisioned years before the launch of the Ares, or as a direct response to this new Federation threat, just as the Ares was?
I think the D7 was in planning for a while. Karn didn't get them when he wanted them, so obviously they were in development. I don't know where along the line of development they were, but they were in development for some time. So what happened is, once Cygnus III happened and the Ares class came on the scene, Karn won his argument with the High Council and they went into production on the D7s. In one way, the D7 was finally authorized as a response to the Ares class, but it wasn't developed originally in response to the Ares class.
Now that brings in another question then. The D7 we see right at the end of Prelude, that tantalizing little shot at firing torpedo, are these D7s that we see, it feels like, as you're saying, they're more of a rushed out version of the D7. Does that mean they're not as capable as D7s we see later on in TOS?
Aha. Well, that is, I really can't tell you that because that might be giving away too much. But I can say that, yes, I definitely think that we see it's 20 years between Axanar and TOS. So the D7s you see in TOS are definitely upgraded in some respects to the ones that you see in Axanar, which are the first ones off the production line. It's like cars. The cars always get better over the life of a production run, and why would it be any different with starships?
So on to the discussion, guys. I really like this Klingon design. I was a fan of the different aesthetics of the D4. As you all know, love the Enterprise bird of prey, and taking into account the Raptor class as well, I think this ship, the D6, really fits neatly not only into the Klingon Armada, but also the era. It feels more bulky and less refined than the D7. It has more to it, like we saw in TOS, as TOS, as we know, is the era of streamlining and simplification. I like how this reflects the move of Klingon thinking as well. Yeah, it feels more opposing, and a powerful warship, as we see in Axanar, is more than a match for any of the Starfleet ships until the Ares came along, that is. I especially like the top part of the bridge module. It's a very recognisable yet different as the Klingon battleship design.
Learning about the ship was great. It was cool to learn about its ramped up energy usage to make it a quick strike attack ship. Also, the whole development of the design and the way it was used by the Klingons. My research uncovered some really cool stories about how the Klingons stole Federation freighters and transports to send out fake distress messages as they approached Federation listening posts along the border, then collided with them to destroy the early warning systems so that they could easily get inside Federation space without being detected for a very effective surprise attack. The design itself is a very cool looking and a great progression from the D5 to D7. Also, learning about this variant design with the missile launcher was a very interesting find, and I like how that could be used to explain any size discrepancies between pre-Axanar and Axanar stats, or a refit, as we mentioned. What do you think of the D6, Alex, both from FASA, Starfleet Battles, and then Tobias's D6, that you now use in Axanar?
Well, I think the D6 in FASA is very FASA. I mean, it makes sense within the time period and the other ships that they developed. I'm glad it looks the way it does. It looks like, it certainly looks very Klingon. Some of those FASA Klingon designs were horrendous. This is not one of them. This the one I like. The problem was when we couldn't use it as a design simply because it doesn't fit in with the rest of the ships in Axanar. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is create a design aesthetic that works as Star Trek, but doesn't work as the way either Star Trek looked 30 years ago, or doesn't look as a retro version of Star Trek TOS, which, as I always say, if you move 20 years before Star Trek TOS, Star Trek is a 50-year-old vision of the future. So if we really were slavish to that, we would be flying Buck Rogers ships. And I don't mean this 80s TV show. I mean the 30s movie serial, Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon with Buster Crabbe. So what we did was simply take a logical look at the ships. It's almost obviously TOS is even simpler than Axanar. So, but you can make that case that designs as they evolved became simpler. The Klingon D7 was simpler than the Klingon D6 because it was bigger, but it was also simpler, and so that's why we make them look the way they do. But the D6, I like initially when I looked at Tobias's design, I felt, well, that was too nice. But also, if you look at the way Tobias did his Klingon ship for Renegades, that makes sense in the terms of that basic design 100 years in the future. So I give Tobias broad latitude on how to design ships.
So if I'd say something I don't like about the Axanar version, well, the thing is I do like the double impulse engines. I love the feel of speed it gives and the extra not refined bulk. Yet, I think it does look a bit too advanced compared to the D7 as seen in TOS. If the secondary impulse engines were much smaller and recessed, in the case of Aviera, they don't have a single impulse drive that can be powerful enough, so they have to put a secondary smaller one to just get the same speed, which then evolves into TOS where they have even less impulse drives, yet more speed. But small thing, I know, but yeah, I had to think of something.
And I always have such a hard time deciding what I don't like about 90% of the ships we do cover, as I like a lot of them. This one would have to be that I feel slightly guilty that I almost prefer the looks of this over the D7. I have always loved the D7 look, but this one seems so much more advanced somehow. So now I feel bad for liking it more than the D7. Now I made myself sad. Is that even a fair thing to say that I don't like? I don't know. It almost feels like I am sort of cheating. So Alec, what's your least favorite thing about the D6 design? Is it that it was responsible for you losing lots of friends during the war, perhaps?
I have a healthy respect for the D6. Yeah, I don't know what God, that's a tough one. What I don't like about
Have
the
to pick a
D6.
thing. We had to as well.
If I pick a thing about the D6 then that I don't like, then it would be honestly, the way we went was we went with a lot more detail on the surface than a D7. The D7 had no detail on the surface. Now, granted, the Katinga goes back to the philosophy of that. So maybe that would be the thing that I would single out. Like, maybe we shouldn't have so much detail on the surface.
It's fine. It's the D6 refit. It's fine.
Yeah, there you go.
So there you have it, guys. An in-depth look at the ship that has always been in the background of Star Trek lore, but never really brought into spotlight until now. Remember, this is the D6 pre-production episode using all the older information, and when Axanar is finally released, we'll work with Alec and the team to bring you a more definitive episode on, I think, in many fans' heads, the now canon Klingon D6.
Well, that's it for this week, guys. It was fun, as always, and as always, I learned a lot. It was great hearing from Alec Peters as well, and I thank him not only for being a guest on Trekyards, but also for bringing us a new vision for the future of Star Trek, and for including such a great ship in Axanar. So thank you, Alec.
Thank you, guys.
Please hit the subscribe button and like this video. Don't forget about the Trekyards Facebook page, and follow us on Twitter as well. Trekyards.com is always available for you to catch up on past Trekyards episodes. And if you wanted to, please click that donate button and give us what you can. That would be awesome. We look forward to seeing you guys next Saturday. Until then, this is Captain Foley.
Simon Cockings.
And
Alec Peters.
Signing off until next time. Bye, guys.